Welcome to Security Take 2, Real Serious Security.
This is episode 4, recorded on the 15th of November 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the city of Atlanta. For those of you that don't remember, the city of Atlanta suffered a major security breach, we'll call it, back in March of 2018. And there are a lot of learnings to take away. I've been going over loads of notes. Chet, you managed to find things in the archive of the internet as well and dug up some really interesting info. Where do we even begin with this one?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I'm going to use that as the excuse for why it's been so long between episodes from when we covered 3CX. And we're finally moving on to our next episode, which I think I teased a month ago. But I'm going to blame the DDoS attack against the Internet Archive because I don't think we could have produced this episode without a few deep dives into the archive to pull up some vanished links. So we do certainly owe the Internet Archive a thank you for the research we did in this episode. And I guess the place to start is just what happened, which, the episode is the city of Atlanta, but, we're not here to talk about the 1996 Olympics or other amazing things about the city of Atlanta so much as their ransomware attack that, this is one of the probably first super high profile, I was going to say the word corporate, which is the wrong word, but let's call it maybe organizational ransomware attacks that kind of made headlines in the United States. Before 2018, most ransomware was targeting individuals. It was things like crypto locker and, locking up your photos on your laptop, demanding, $300 in prepaid gift cards or, this type of an attack. And the group behind the attack on the city of Atlanta, alleged by the U.S. Department of Justice to be a group called SamSam, started realizing how much more money they could get from organizations if they disrupted them rather than individuals. And unfortunately, the city of Atlanta was one of the earlier victims of SamSam, and it had a massive disruption to the city's ability to function, right? It affected 5 of their 13 different departments within the city. Most importantly, it made it impossible for the police to access their records. You couldn't get into their infrastructure maintenance systems to, file complaints about potholes to be repaired in the highway or in the road in front of your house and this kind of thing. It affected the judicial system and its ability to collect penalties from people who were convicted and sentenced to pay a fine. It affected all ability for them to do any kind of revenue collection, which is kind of an important thing for any entity. Things like people paying their water bills, paying speeding tickets, parking tickets. It just was a widespread disruption, and it wasn't just widespread, but it was long lasting. I was reading in some of the coverage in the media that as late as June, so 3 months after the attack, that still major systems were not back online and their ability to function was still impaired.
Yeah. Now, you actually missed out one critical service. The Wi-Fi at the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was also disabled during the attack. So that's pretty catastrophic to end users, right?
Yeah, and interesting. I mean, at the time of that outage, Atlanta Hartsfield Airport was the busiest airport on the planet. So it maximized the number of people who could be disrupted when Wi-Fi's out at the airport. Because, as of the time of recording in late 2024, recently the Port of Seattle was also ransomed by a group called Ransom Hub. And one of the long-lasting outages from that was also the Wi-Fi at SeaTac Airport in Seattle being disabled. But turning off the Wi-Fi at Atlanta Hartsfield, sorry, Seattle, is even more of an impact.
Yeah. So to go back to it, as you said, this was the first real active adversarial style of attack that we saw against organizations, right? So we had ransomware groups, or I should say malware strains like CryptoLocker, that was actually more focused at consumer-based devices. And like you said, gift cards, $700 US, and we'll give you back all of your family photos. Then we saw WannaCry attack organizations, and all of a sudden people were talking about malware that was going to worm again. and these automated attacks built into the malware to exploit SMB, and we thought that was going to be the start of worm in malware. And then all of a sudden, SamSam come into the picture and do this attack with the city of Atlanta. And it was this real pivot. In my opinion, this was that pivotal moment in cybersecurity where most attacks turn to this active adversarial style of attack outside of being, the NSA or law enforcement trying to take down organizations or do cyber espionage. So I've always had this one in my slide decks as like the turning point in 2018 for cybersecurity. What I found interesting with this attack, and it's weird, it was reported in a lot of areas that the attack started with brute forcing. And everywhere you look, it says that this attack started with brute forcing. It was a shift from phishing. And then I actually had to do a bit of digging to say, well, what was actually brute forced for this particular attack? And lo and behold, it was RDP. From what I can tell, I don't know if you found any conflicting information, but it seems like the city of Atlanta had a lot of public-facing RDP, and even once the SamSam were inside the network, every device had RDP or remote desktop protocol turned on, and they just kept brute forcing around, finding valid credentials, and using that to laterally move from one subnet to another.
Yeah, I don't have anything contradictory to that, certainly. And I agree with you about the pivot point. I mean, I personally always attributed the pivot point to the group behind this more, which is SamSam, as opposed to necessarily specifically the city of Atlanta in this case. But this was the one that got the media's attention, certainly, for that pivot into this type of an attack. And maybe that's one of the reasons that they did have that kind of an exposure to things like RDP. Like, previous to that, having a remote access tool compromise, whether that be VNC or RDP or whatever form of it you might have, if you're really old, maybe it was PC Anywhere, but usually it was shenanigans, right? Like it didn't result in multi-million-dollar impacts. It was just an embarrassment that a computer got accessed remotely, or maybe some data was accessed, and often probably swept under the rug. And because of the kind of dialing up of the sophistication and cost of these attacks by, as you say, having an active adversary involved, suddenly it wasn't really a joke anymore. And that's not an excuse for why that port should have been exposed to the internet in 2018, but it is something that I think the awareness level of how dangerous that activity really was just starting to ramp up in the IT public's consciousness, if you will, because there hadn't been any high-profile, dangerous exploitation of it anywhere near what it ended up costing the city of Atlanta. And I think we should talk a bit about the hygiene at the city of Atlanta, and I'll hand it to you to do that in a moment. But what attracted me to this story, like this, you're positioning it as a pivot point, what attracted it to me as well is that I felt like it was misrepresented to the public. And that's why we do this podcast, right? To dispel the myths around the stories that we all kind of think and assume to be true. And the myth around this story was, to me, summed up in the Wired article that was one of the first ones that got a lot of attention in April of 2018. Wired had an article titled, "Atlanta Spent $2.6 million to recover from a $52,000 ransomware incident." And I feel like the narrative of this story in the public was, why would you not pay the $50,000 instead of the $2.7 million? Now, both of those things are complete misconceptions, and that's what we're here to dispel today. But that's what attracted me as well. Not only was this pivot point to the active adversary, it was also a pivot point where the media's reporting on it kind of, I think, buried the lead. There was a lot more interesting lessons to be learned. Not you should pay ransoms to get out of these situations, but rather these situations are a culmination of things that build up over time, and that's what makes them so costly. And like that RDP exposure is part of that, but it wasn't just RDP, was it?
No. Now, rant alert potentially here. I don't want to victim blame here, so I'm going to try and avoid it as much as possible. But let's go back to their cyber hygiene and then maybe loop back around to, the costs involved. So it was actively reported that in a security audit, the city of Atlanta had 1,500 to 2,000 vulnerabilities identified throughout their computer systems. Now, when I first read that, I had a bit of a chuckle. And the reason why I laughed about it was, when you typically hear such high numbers in a vulnerability assessment, in a penetration test or similar, I often think to myself, well, the assessor was trying to pump up the numbers to make their report sound impressive. And the chances are, it was filled with informational alerts, say, generated by their vulnerability assessment platform or similar. But then, having gone through what you sent me from the Internet Archive, back in April 2017, the city of Atlanta suffered from a security incident from Double Pulsar, which utilized Eternal Blue, which was an SMB exploit that came from the NSA Shadow Brokers leak. I've got that correct, don't I, Chet? I always forget the name of these groups. Yep, cool.
Yes, absolutely.
So that was the same vulnerability that was utilized in malware like WannaCry that had the ability to laterally move within networks by looking for SMB version 1 turned on and then being able to exploit that and get remote code to execute, install malware, and continually worm through your network. So a year prior to this ransomware attack, they had a warning shot. Not almost. They had a warning shot to say, well, we were infected by Double Pulsar. We had this exploitation take place in my network. That alone should have been a moment for the city of Atlanta to say, we've got work to do. We got lucky this time around. But instead, it looks like they did nothing. Now, in March of 2018, so a year beyond that event, somebody tweeted, I don't know how to pronounce the username, Hugh, maybe? The username on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, was HUYKHA10. And they listed a bunch of Atlanta.gov hosts that were online. Now, they all had SMB v1 enabled. They were all Windows hosts. They had port 80, 8080, 443, 445, which is Active Directory, 5985, which is Windows RM, and port 3389, which is Remote Desktop Protocol enabled, as well as FTP in there. So we had these hosts on the internet from Atlanta government that had a number of critical ports and services exposed to the internet. Now, this is a year on from the Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar, let's call it warning shot, which really makes me wonder what was going on inside of the Atlanta government to not take action when they had the opportunity. They received the pen test report that said, you've got 1,500 issues. But then it looks like these basic cyber hygiene things, like critical services on the internet, were just not resolved in any meaningful time frame. What are your thoughts on that, Chet?
I feel like you've set me up, even though we didn't plan this. Our listeners have to understand we did not actually structurally plan this podcast, but you're pitching me softballs here because this is exactly the problem. I'm a mid-level bureaucrat in a large city municipality that's been entrusted with the responsibility to run the IT systems, and I have a lot of trusted people reporting to me that are doing the actual work and have the technical knowledge to a large degree. And you hand me a report that says I have 2,000 problems in my network. And I'm supposed to figure out, how do I even take a bite out of this and where do I start? This is a mountain of problems and I don't know where to begin. And I think that's not an excuse. Don't take this wrong, saying that what happened is okay. But it is a problem, I think, for management to be able to recognize and how to prioritize and assess the risk of those things effectively. And, a colleague of mine in the past that I still work with did a bunch of research on just how things like CVSS scores of vulnerabilities actually kind of fail when they're put into practice in the field, because something that is a 10 but is in code that never gets executed, or maybe it's behind firewalls in a isolated part of the network, is very different than code that also scores 10 that is in your firewall or in, an internet facing Windows server, to your point about some of those exposed ports. And those standardized business tools that we provide people do not accurately reflect the danger from any given one of those vulnerabilities. And when you get a report with 2,000 things in it, whether it's somebody's pen test tool flagging lots of unnecessary things, or whether they're all legitimate maybe, but even if they're all legitimate, where do you start chipping away at that? And it's really hard often for inexperienced folks that don't have deep backgrounds in security to quickly identify the most important and critical of those things. And unfortunately, I think it does take a fair bit of experience to categorize them. And I mean, it's not as easy as it looks, and especially not within government bureaucracy systems in the way that they're structured. They're not flexible and nimble the way we would all desire them to be.
You're right. But as someone, like I've presented penetration testing reports to customers before, and typically a big part of that is a risk register. And one of the discussions you have with your key stakeholders is, look, there are some quick wins here that we can reduce this down. And I just, especially with the, like SMB v1 still enabled on servers that are connected to the internet a year after the double pulsar infection that they had, that kind of stuff is a low-hanging fruit where a sysadmin should be able to look at that report and say, this has been identified as a vulnerability. Eternal Blue is present in my network. Overnight, let's push out a GP update or a group policy update and just disable that. And all of a sudden, that list of 2,000 vulnerabilities might be down to 500. Now let's go through and reclassify them in bite-sized chunks for each department to then go and address. Like, the last thing you should do when you get a massive report with loads of vulnerabilities is say, this is too overwhelming. I'm going to put this in my top drawer and forget about it.
You win, because they also had FTP exposed, which is one you didn't mention. That's the one that bothers me the most. And so I'm gonna take your side in this argument now.
Yeah.
But let's talk about that, because there were some obvious things to do. And there was some emergency spending, let's call it. It's not a situation you ever want to be in. I'll preface that with, from what I can tell in the research that I was able to conduct, it did not appear that there were any cyber insurance involved or any of that kind of thing. But it looks like one of the more immediate things that was done once they realized the gravity of the incident is they brought in some assistance from Ernst & Young, very famous Big Five accounting lawyer cyber firm. That does not automatically make them great, but I think we can all recognize them as very deep and often expensive experts. So come in and help us figure this out. They, according to the emergency procurement documents that were published publicly online by the city of Atlanta, they spent $600,000 on consultancy from Ernst & Young. They also brought in SecureWorks to do their emergency incident response to help them. Again, I don't know SecureWorks processes, but they gave them $650,000. So apparently quite a lot of those services and processes. And often, certainly when my experience when you do incident response, you're first trying to limit further damage, then you're trying to evict the criminals from the estate to make sure that they're no longer present and can cause no more harm. Then you go into kind of the phase of assessing the damage and figuring out what you're going to be able to do to start recovering from that. And it's a very expensive and painful process to go through. So just between those two alone, there's a little over $1.2 million that was spent, in addition to bringing in Cisco for some emergency response and lots and lots of other expenditures there. But what I found interesting as part of this emergency response spending is the ones that are lower in the chart, a little later in the process as things were going on. Things like bringing in SHI, a large system integrator, to do two-factor authentication using Duo multi-factor. So they recognized that having that RDP exposed without a second factor, maybe they couldn't get away with not having the RDP. There was some critical function they really needed it for, but at least they brought in MFA or multi-factor authentication. They emergency purchased Cisco SmartNet contracts, suggesting that much of their network gear was Cisco and was probably not under maintenance, and therefore wasn't getting updates, and maybe that was part of their problems as well. But there were some quick Band-Aids applied by bringing in experts, so it feels like there was some recognition of where their problems were, that they needed to get the fixes in.
Yeah, even like Microsoft appears on the emergency procurement a lot, and they spent a couple $1 million with Microsoft or Microsoft partners alone. And a lot of it was around like cloud engineering and professional services. Now, the fact that they had Active Directory directly on the internet with some of those hosts I talked about earlier would suggest that their Active Directory was compromised, and they decided that was a good chance to pivot to Azure Active Directory or Entra ID. Of course, I'm making some assumptions there, but by reading this procurement chart, you can draw some conclusions that, they pivoted to Azure Active Directory more than likely, and they've turned on Duo multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, and so that was one of the things I referred to earlier that attracted me to this story, which is, again, how we read something in the media and then maybe we misinterpret. Now, I'm not going to pick on the Wired story too much, because at the time the Wired story published it said it was a $2.6 million incident. In the end, it looks like it was about a $17 million incident, and probably even more than that may not have ultimately been associated with it. And when you're going, well, why wouldn't you pay the $50,000 in ransom rather than the $17 million in costs? But it's really not that way, right? Like, that 17 million was modernizing and doing many of the things that ought to have been done for many years, and just doing the investment as a result of the incident. And it's always more expensive and costly to make an emergency expenditure to do it in a crisis than it is to do it as a planned maintenance thing ahead of time that you ought to have been doing all along. And we can't tease out how much of that 17 million was directly related to it being an emergency instead of having perhaps done it a year or two earlier. Maybe, to use your example, the wake up call, the double pulsar incident, to start implementing some of these changes proactively as opposed to reactively during an incident. But it is clear by my back of the envelope, at least $1.5 million of that spend was simply because it was a crisis. I mean, literally things like crisis communication services for $50,000. Surge support staff augmentation, literally extra tech support people to answer phone calls and help deal with the crisis. Subject matter expert emergency consulting services, $1.5 million of it, without any doubt, was only because it was related to an incident. And if I had to take a guess, I would say probably half of that 17 million was related to it having to be done on the double while systems were broken, while you're in crisis mode, with much more expensive consultancy rather than maybe in-house resource to deploy and configure things because of the emergency nature of it. And it was a big deal, right? Like, for the longest time, the police couldn't access any of their records. Now, ultimately, they did get the records back. They never got their video footage back of all the body cams and cameras from police cars. That was all permanently deleted, probably had ongoing impacts to court cases and prosecutions where that was evidence that was now gone. The extensive damage of this is way beyond the $17 million.
Yeah, and then there's the positive flow-on effect as well, right? So you spend the $17 million, or even like the $5 million in this case, and you get everything done all at once by professional services when, I guess, to jump to their defense after I may have made some unkind claims is, maybe they got the penetration test report back and it had 2,000 vulnerabilities in it. Then they handed it off to project managers to say, hey, you need to project manage each and one of these. You can't have an outage, so you need to do seamless migration to new systems. And there could be a lot of maybe there's a 3-year strategic plan at place for them to fix these issues. But when you're in crisis and you can get anything signed off immediately, you might even get some federal funding for it to get back online. It's a perfect time to uplift your system, and you're already offline, so it's a good chance to make these changes to those systems prior to the planned project execution date. But really, yeah, looking at the emergency procurement, Chet, you would say that SecureWorks and the $650,000 they spent there was probably enough to evict the cyber criminals, but after that, they probably would have just been reinfected by another criminal organization months down the track, if not by the same adversaries that attacked them in the first place.
Yeah. These the things that lead to these incidents need to be addressed in addition to the incident, and it's hard to tease out the two pieces separately, right? And I don't know how important it is, but I think it was worth. I wanted to raise it in this podcast to go. To your point, the way to get the investment is not to wait until you have one of these incidents so you can do all your upgrading, which I know is not what you were intending. But I mean, you could easily interpret it to go, well, we can just ignore this until it's a crisis, and then we'll get a bunch of federal funding. And this is not the way to do it, folks. Like, it is much cheaper and more efficient to do it other ways. But if you're ever in the unfortunate circumstance that you are in a position that this has happened to you, do not waste the opportunity to ask for some budget.
Yeah, it's worth noting too, this happened 6 years ago, and as we said at the start, it was that pivot point. So it's easy to sit back now and have these conversations with a lot of organizations because, you can sit down with an IT manager for a 100-user organization and say, have you or any of your peers experienced an active adversary within your network, specifically ransomware? And most of them in 2024 would nod their head and say, yes, it was the worst day of my life, or it was the worst day of my peers' life. We don't want that to happen. But in 2018, when a lot of it was still consumer-based ransomware, going after photos, videos, and things like that and asking a small amount, I could see how the sell was a little bit harder to stakeholders potentially to get these things sorted out as well. So to jump to their defense slightly, a lot's changed in 6 years, almost 7 years. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of learnings you can take away from here. So just quickly, they never paid. So the actual ransom they wanted was $52,000, which in today's money isn't that much for a ransom. We're seeing much higher ransom demands in general. There was a lot of criticism, like from Wired, to say they spent $2.6 million to avoid paying $52,000. But yeah, just to go back to your point earlier, if they had have paid the $52,000, they may not have then fixed their networks, or they would have had to spend $2.6 million or $17 million over the next few years to fix those problems anyway. So by them not paying the ransom is actually a good thing. Based on the time, it sent a really good message to say, you know what, we are not going to pay the ransom. We are not going to be your victim. We will get ourselves out of this, which is something that a lot more organizations should do and still don't. A lot of people are happy to pay the ransom to get out of having to worry about, proper critical incident response and cleaning up their networks themselves. So ransoms are clearly still being paid. That's why they're going up. And it's why more and more cyber criminal organizations are flourishing and making loads of money.
Well, normally I would say I would conclude this by discussing the then indictment of the criminals that were involved in this, SamSam. However, I'm going to use that as a teaser for the next episode because I've decided when we were doing this research that SamSam as a topic in and of itself is interesting enough to warrant its own episode without a particular victim, but more about kind of how it evolved, developed, how they worked their pricing, how they laundered their money, and the increasing interest of countries that are under sanction with allowing maybe cyber criminals to bring in some additional currency through these types of attacks that I think we kind of consider somewhat commonplace now, but again was somewhat novel when it was done in these attacks. So why don't we wrap up here and then do our next episode on all the interesting bits that we know about SamSam and share that with our listeners, and along with maybe it'll lessen the blow to the city of Atlanta a little bit when we hear about the laundry list of other organizations that were compromised by SamSam.
Sounds good to me. I'm really looking forward to talking about SamSam, and it has been hard not to dive in. So, all right, let's leave it there and talk about SamSam next.
Thanks, Ben. I think that's good. I'm Chester Wisniewski. As always, we love to get your feedback, and we hope you're able to subscribe wherever you like to get podcasts. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@securitytake2. You can go to our website with links to everything, show notes, links to the source materials we used in this podcast at securitytake2.com. You can always email us at hosts@securitytake2.com. And we're on Reddit as well, aren't we, Ben?
We certainly are. So you can find us on Reddit at reddit.com/r/security take two. That is TOWO.